Welcome to today's Economy Committee meeting. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag Assembly Economy for this meeting. Please may I remind everyone to switch phones to silent mode and and I'm going to ask the members and guests ensure that your electronic devices are not placed in front of the microphones. Today our main item of business is a discussion on barriers to work for people who have had contact with the criminal justice system. Before we begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I now ask the committee clerk, Jack Booth, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies from Assembly Member Kripesh Harani.
Thank you, and we wish him many congratulations. Baby number two?
Baby number two. First thing this morning.
Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we confirm the minutes of the Economy Committee meeting held on the 18th of January 2023 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Confirmed.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings?
Noted. Yep.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the response from the Mayor to the committee's letter on London Street and covered markets?
Noted.
Thank you. We're now going to move on to our main item of business, the discussion with invited guests on barriers to work for people who have had contact with the criminal justice system. After the first set of questions, we will have a short adjournment because it's actually quite a long meeting, so if you need to have a quick break, you're absolutely fine to do that, for about just 5 minutes before going on to the next part of the meeting. So welcome to all our guests who've come to the chamber today. Darren Burns is on his way, I hope, very shortly, and he's the Director of Diversity Inclusion from the Timpson Group. Duncan O'Leary, Chief Executive Officer for New Futures Network, welcome. Angela Cairns, from Chief Executive Officer from Unlock, thank you. Will Balakrishnan, from the Director of Commissioning and Partnership from MOPAC, thanks for coming. had to come from a long way, obviously. And Natasha Finlayson, from the Chief Executive Officer from Working Chance. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm going to start off the first 2 questions. The first question is going to go to all of our guests. So if I start from you, Natasha, then we'll go across, if that's okay, and hopefully Darren will be here in time to answer the question. What are the main barriers to work faced by people in London who have had contact with the criminal justice system, and are there any demographic groups that are disproportionately impacted by these barriers?
So I'm a specialist in women with convictions and their employment. That's what we do at Working Chance. And about half of the women that we work with have served custodial sentences. So for those women, there are kind of 2 key factors. One is what is going on with them psychologically and emotionally after their conviction, and indeed throughout their life often. And the other part to that is what is going on in their immediate life, particularly after release from prison. And then the separate issue is employer prejudice, which is very significant and affects both men and women with convictions. So if I just sort of go back to the first part, so women, particularly women who've left prison recently, will be struggling with self-worth, with confidence, more serious mental health problems. We have to remember that the majority of them have severe childhood trauma. So they have very, very difficult and challenging lives going right back to childhood. Over 60% of them have experienced sexual abuse as children, so there's a huge correlation there. And we know that the legacy of that is often left untreated and unaddressed, and can lead to mental health issues, lack of self-confidence, as I said, and potentially problems around substance abuse and alcoholism. So while I don't want to generalise about women who have convictions or who are in prison, there is a significant cluster of women who are struggling with those issues and haven't had the support to address that. When they leave prison, a significant proportion of them will be trying to get their children back out of the care system, because most children whose mum is in prison, they go into care. If the father's in prison, that's not often the case. They'll also be struggling with accommodation, so over half of women leaving prison will not be going to secure and stable accommodation. So as you can clearly see, that is setting them up to fail in the first place. And so all of those factors are going to get in the way of them being in the right mindset to feel work ready and to start that job search and to be presenting themselves kind of confidently to employers. And then, when they do get to that point of going for job interviews, they face employer prejudice. Everybody with convictions potentially comes up across this. So we did some market research recently which showed that things were getting much better. The prejudice was breaking down. There was greater awareness that people with convictions should be included in diversity and inclusion programmes in terms of recruitment into the workforce, and that they bring a lot. However, 30% of employers still said that they wouldn't, under any circumstance, employ somebody with an unspent conviction, which goes to the heart of, I think, the lack of understanding of what rehabilitation is and the fact that employment is the main driver in reducing reoffending.
Thank you so much. We will be talking a little bit more about particularly the female ex-offenders after the first round of this question, but we'll come back to you about that, Natasha. Will, do you want to add on to the barriers that are facing people?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. I mean, I'll try and set them out briefly because I know there'll be a conversation. But look, I mean, it is a long list, and I think the complexity of this group means that many of them are not ready to access the education, training and employment, even support pre-job. And I think Natasha did a really good job of starting that conversation. But I mean, just some sort of, some obvious barriers. Substance misuse. 40% of the current London probation caseload have a drug problem linked to their offending. And alcohol dependence, binge drinking, all of that falls into that category, and clearly that's going to be a significant barrier. Mental health. So 65%, almost two-thirds of women, for example, we do a lot of women's co-commissioning that other committees will have heard about, but in prison reported they had mental health issues. So obviously that, and that's 2/5 of men, 42%. Clearly that is significantly in excess of the general population figures. In fact, in London, 75% of persistent violent offenders in integrated offender management, one of our things, have psychological problems or depression. So clearly mental health is huge. We often forget about physical health problems. So again, we know a lot about women. A third of women and nearly a third of men in prison report they have a disability. That compares with only 22% in the UK. Neurodiversity. So a third of people in prison reported they have a learning disability or difficulty. We don't actually really know the true extent of that in the criminal justice system, and I chair London's Reducing Reoffending Board. We're doing a lot of work on neurodiversity because we think that's an even bigger challenge. Unstable accommodation and homelessness. So the Police and Crime Committee did some work on this, I know. Look, it remains a significant problem. Clearly also poor employment and poor basic skills. So I think 55% of people last year who entered prison had the literacy skills expected of an 11-year-old. That's 3 times higher than in the general population. The stigma, and we've talked a little bit about it, but the stigma of a criminal record, there are 11 million people in the UK with a criminal record. The stats I have in front of me are 50%, in fact, of employers, different survey, but it's going to be within that realm, isn't it, wouldn't hire someone who was an ex-offender. Slightly different question. You asked about particular groups. I mean, let's be honest, ethnic minority groups are more likely to be unemployed, full stop. They're more likely to live in London, and they're overrepresented in the criminal justice system. So, just looking at general stats, 4% of white people in London were unemployed versus 8% of people from all other ethnic groups. And I know the committee, I'm sure, will have looked at that in the past and will know those stats well. So really it's those multiple complex issues, I think. It's both risk factors for reoffending, but also those are barriers for education. Just one group, that I always feel obliged to highlight is, of course, care leavers. So, or young people who have care experience is the way that they like to be referred to. We know that just in the general population, you sort of 4 out of 10 of care leavers will be not in education, training and employment, and we know they're overrepresented in the criminal justice system. So, There's a long list of barriers. Sorry, I could go on, but maybe I'll leave it there as an intro.
You've done a grand job there, Will. Thank you. If Angela and the rest of the panel can come in with anything additional, would really like to hear from you. So we'll start with Angela.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to sort of reinforce the point that Natasha made near the beginning, that actually this is an issue about people coming out of prison and making sure that they can get into secure work and the other services that they need. But the majority of the now 12 million, just over 12 million people in the UK who have a criminal record have never been to prison. So they're often a hidden group of people who face similar barriers to employment because of having to disclose criminal records, sometimes for a disproportionate amount of times. And this real thing about stigma, prejudice, discrimination is very, very real. So stigma can prevent people from even applying for a job in the first place. They can see that they're going to be asked, I can talk more about that later, to disclose their conviction. They often don't know if they have to or not, or if they're being asked the right questions. But also there's a real negative narrative around having a criminal record. Even a very historic criminal record for a very minor thing can be seen as an employer as the worst case scenario. And frequently we do see people who are sort of sifted out at the first wave of recruitment, particularly when you've got online recruitment and you tick that box and that's your application done. So there's a big sort of education process there about who are people with criminal records? Because essentially, like, if it's 12 million people, 1 in 6 people in the UK, then we all know people. They're the people that we are friends with, they're our families, they're the people that we work with and maybe don't know about. So negative narratives and labelling is a huge issue for people with criminal records of all kinds. And just to sort of say, yes, all of the things that Natasha and Will have said about this being a really complex situation, it's about a person at the heart of it. But I have to say that employment, so Unlock, we have a helpline. We have 9 million calls to that helpline a year, and overwhelmingly, not 9 million, 9,000. That would be huge. As overinflating as that. 9,000. Overwhelmingly, most of them are about employment.
Thank you so much for mentioning your work on Unlock as well. That's really important. And do mention it again later as well. I think it's important to do that. Yeah, if you have anything to add on, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Briefly. So my team is part of the Prison Probation Service. And
do you mind putting your mics on before you speak? Thank you.
Thank you. So I was just saying my team's part of the Prison and Probation Service, and we focus on people who are in prison and leaving prison. So that's who I'm talking about here. Just 3 very quick things. One is, as mentioned, willingness of employers to offer a job, and actually the risk of some people self-selecting out as well, which I'll come back to in a moment. Second would be job readiness, which Will mentioned. And then the third is, I think that hanging on to a job is just a really important thing, not just finding the job. So on the first of those, I think Natasha's right that attitudes are gradually shifting in the right direction, partly because employers see others doing it and benefiting from it, partly because I think the economy is changing as well and employers are more open-minded, I think, about where their staff come from. On the job readiness side, I think the literacy and vocational skills are important, but actually lots of the employers we work with, the key thing they're looking for is somebody who is, in the broadest sense, ready for work, so ready to collaborate with other people, turn up every day, overcome difficulties, be presentable, all those things that are the kind of basics, and often they're willing to do more of the training. So, of course, having a vocational qualification is great, but having that baseline is really important. The other, for people leaving prison, a couple of other really big ones are just having the very basics of a bank account and right to work ID. People often don't have a bank account or have lost touch with it one way or another, don't have a birth certificate to show that they actually can work, which can be a barrier. And then just on I think the sustaining employment part of it is really important because, as I'm sure Darren might talk about in a minute, people can typically have a wobble a few weeks into work, something goes wrong, their accommodation disappears, or they haven't quite sorted out a family relationship. So I think having the support structures around people to help them, whether that's from the employer, from statutory services, or from some of the really excellent charities in London, makes a huge difference to actually people holding down their employment too.
And let's talk more about Timpson's. I have to say, I find what you do quite inspirational when it comes to this, and I'm very, very pleased that you're here to talk about this. And tell us a little bit more about those life stories that you're probably having to deal with all the time when it comes to this particular issue.
Yeah, so an interesting part of my role within the Timpson Foundation is that I help other businesses to employ from this cohort, which can be quite challenging. So typically what some of the other panel members have said kind of rings true, in that stigma is kind of alive and well. Many employers who are keen to recruit from this cohort, driven by the sort of buoyancy in the labour market, will report to us that the concerns are that ex-offenders or prison leavers are inherently dishonest, inherently untrustworthy, dangerous. They don't know what terminology, what language to use. So what we're able to do is give them obviously positive examples of where it worked very well for us in the past. But again, I think the vast majority of what I wanted to say has already been picked up by the other panel members. Work readiness is a huge one. We estimate only about a third of prison leavers are actually work ready. The other 2/3, very sadly, have got lots of complex needs and issues surrounding mental health, physical health, addiction, homelessness, or a combination of all of them. So that does leave a sort of smaller pool of work ready prison leavers. Another point, just to pick up on what Duncan said, is that there seems to be a lack of willingness by some employees to give a degree of flexibility for prison leavers. Obviously, leaving prison is often more traumatic than going to prison in the first place. So in that initial kind of crucial stage where you leave custody through the gate into the workplace, people will need some sort of flexibility, whether they're going to be late a few times, whether they've got probation appointments or other appointments to keep. We give flexibility to our colleagues, and we encourage other employees to do that as well. Lack of knowledge, understanding about risk is quite a big one. So one of the main concerns that I find with other employers is they talk about risk, but my major sort of criticism is that they've got no real understanding of risk or how to interpret risk. And what they often do is kind of jump to the most extreme conclusions. So they will say things like, we don't know anybody who's committed any violent offences, not realising that all offences, including violent offences, occur on a spectrum of severity. So people will tend to lump everybody in with one particular type of offence, which can be quite damaging. But yeah, I think most of it's been picked up by the other panel members.
Can I just ask an additional question? What made your company decide to take this route? It's a bold step for many, and other companies would think twice about it. So what's the difference here?
Well, I certainly can't take any credit for it. So it was back in 2002 when our CEO, James Timpson, was invited to a local prison, HMP Thorncross, which is a male category D prison in the northwest. James was shown round by a young chap named Matt, who was a serving inmate. Matt was very intelligent, very articulate, very confident, very chatty. James liked him and thought he'd make a great addition to the Timpson business, so give him a business card and employed him 4 months later when he got released. So at that moment, James kind of realised if there's one great candidate like Matt in one small prison, surely there's going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of candidates like Matt who just need that opportunity, just need that second chance. So we then began to proactively recruit ex-offenders into the Timpson business. Currently, about 12% of our entire workforce are made up of people who we've either directly recruited from custody or who've got an offending background. And it's been a huge positive for our organisation.
That's, like I said, inspirational. Thank you so much. Natasha, I just want to carry on that conversation that you started about women in particular. And they tend to serve more non-violent, shorter sentences than their male counterparts. And you've talked a little bit about the issues of trauma and the additional responsibility of children, all of these issues. Can you just tell us a little bit more about those challenges that they're facing?
So approximately 77% of women in prison have committed non-violent offences. The most common offence that they commit is shoplifting, and a significant proportion of those offences are shoplifting for their children. So it's things like nappies and baby milk and so on. So in effect, what that means is that we're criminalising poverty. The women that we put in prison mostly are not the women who should be there. They're the women who need community support and services for, kind of trauma and substance abuse and alcoholism and all the things that mostly are a legacy of very, very difficult, neglectful, dysfunctional childhoods. So, I think, the answer is to go back to to go back upstream and not put them in prison in the first place, and to increase the use of community sentences. So, what we used to call community service, which has declined over the last 10 years by about 70% for women, which is really, really worrying and indicates that there is, I think, a lack of understanding on the part of judges and magistrates of the devastating consequences of putting these sorts of women, who are the majority, into prison, and what that means for their children and what that means for the likelihood of them reoffending. So, as you said, short sentences are a huge problem. So initially one might think, oh, a short sentence seems much better than a long sentence, but that isn't the case at all, because a short sentence is just long enough to do damage to, you know, the woman's kind of housing, family relationships, to lose your children, to lose your job, to have, you know, all the things that kind of create stability in your life completely fractured. But it's short enough that you don't benefit from any rehabilitative programs within prison. So you come out, you know, the same as you went in, but you've lost all those things that are so important to you. So short sentences are devastating. And I think, like, you know, many people here, we would absolutely support the abolition of short sentences under 12 months for women, because it's a waste of everybody's money and time, and generally leads to a spiral of reoffending on women's parts, on the part of women.
You mentioned the magistrates there as well. Is that a lack of education, a lack of training? Is that something that you're pushing for as well in terms of change that's necessary?
Yep, so MOJ's done quite a lot of work with the judiciary, although I think there's more to do with district judges, but magistrates are where the bulk of women are sentenced. So while there's a huge variety, and there are many magistrates who have a really, really sensitive, nuanced, in-depth understanding of these women's lives and their challenges, that's not the case for all magistrates. There's always need for more training in every profession, isn't there? And given that the stakes are so high here in terms of the damage that short sentences in prison does to women's lives, and that the cost is so high of keeping people in prison and the cost of reoffending, it would seem, you know, very, very logical and cost effective that we invest in training programs for the magistracy to understand what's actually going to happen when they pass a prison sentence on that type of woman from that kind of background.
Thank you. I could ask you a load more questions, but I'm going to be moving on to Assembly Member Ahmed for the next set. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, panel. Angela, what is the rationale behind the current process of DBS checks, and what impact is this having on the employment opportunities for ex-offenders?
So it's a little bit of time travel back to 1974, when the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act came in and set out the principle that after a certain period of time, most people should be able to not have to disclose their criminal convictions anymore. They can be in terms of employment, housing, etc., and be able to move on. And over the years, there have been many changes to this. Some have been beneficial, but layers and layers of legislation, time and time again. And so it's a very complicated system, and the DBS checking system is quite complicated in itself, and knowing, particularly for employers, but also with people's criminal records, how that needs to be applied. The current system is very often very much seen as we have to do this because of safeguarding, and safeguarding is an element to the checking regime. However, as we all, I think, will be aware of, safeguarding is not just that element of it itself. There have been improvements in making it possible for fewer people to have to disclose their criminal records, and so then be able to get into work. The Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, which passed last year, is one of those. That will reduce some of those spending periods for people and mean fewer people have to disclose for shorter periods of time. However, that has not been implemented yet, and we are still being told that it's unlikely to be implemented till at least December this year. So it's quite an 18-month waiting period for people there. So obviously, we have a system with three main tiers to it. So a basic check, a standard check, and an enhanced check. So standard is for professional roles, and those are things like if you're a solicitor, and then enhanced is based around safeguarding duties. So it is if someone is working unsupervised with children or with vulnerable adults. there's a lot of complexity in that as to when that applies and not, and like a number of times you're doing it. So we have a really complicated system. But if we just kind of think about very basic checks, those are not about regulation of a profession. They're not necessarily about safeguarding children or vulnerable adults. All employers have the right to ask applicants about any unspent convictions. And so they ask those. They have a right. They don't have to. A lot of employers will do that anyway without thinking through that. So, and we know that for people applying for jobs, just seeing a question on an application form can make them make a decision not to apply for that job. We call that the chilling effect. It's like kind of you could have someone who has really good skills, really good abilities, and the experience, but not being able to go into a job. Often there's a lot of confusion around when a certain check can be asked for, and we've seen a lot of rises in them. So in terms of basic checks, in the past 3 years, we've seen a 60% rise in the number of basic checks that are being asked for employers. So while Natasha and Working Chances market research was brilliant to show that attitudes are changing, this is also the flip side of it. More people are checking than they were before. And if people disclose something on a basic check, or they forget, because sometimes people have multiple convictions, they might not remember when it's spent or understand that very well because of the complexity involved with it. If it shows up on that check, an employer will see that as a test of honesty when it isn't necessarily that thing at all. And so, it can lead also to people mentioning convictions when they don't legally have to. And in those situations, that's a sort of a difficult position for an employer, because if they're not legally allowed to apply something. So if I said to you, if you're an employer and you said, I want to do this check, have you got any convictions? And I disclose something that's spent and I don't have to disclose it for that role, then you as an employer are not allowed to regard it. However, the lack of knowledge and training and understanding of a lot of employers and a lot of people with criminal records themselves plays into this as well, makes that quite difficult. And just to say, so just sort of a bit of an example here, things very small, disproportionate criminal convictions can last with people for a lifetime. So a caution for arson can have really long-term implications for a disclosure. Now, you might say arson and people are hearing the word arson, but because it's a caution, it's being given at quite a low level on the basis that people should be able to move on with that. So, but they will have to, because of the nature of that offence, they're going to have to keep on disclosing that for a long period of time. We do quite a lot of work with DBS, and there has been a review of the DBS system going on, which we've fed into, and we're waiting for the sort of outcomes for that. But the system basically is so complicated that it is tripping up employers, it's tripping up people with criminal records and anyone else sort of involved in that.
Thank you very much. That was a very comprehensive answer, and a lot to think about there. What impact would making the DBS filters less broad have on the employment prospects of ex-offenders? I'm just wary of time as well, so if you could be brief, please. Thank you.
I will, sorry. All kinds of things. It would allow more people to get into employment, to feel confident that their convictions, if clear guidance is around this, that their convictions are not going to come up time and time again, that they're not going to have to sort of repeat that trauma. And there are all kinds of idiosyncrasies in the system, such as for young people, for example, who's not necessarily, their brains haven't matured as much as adults, so they may not have that maturity, will be judged disproportionately, lots of different things in there. So it really is about giving people the opportunity to move on with their lives or to continue living their lives that they're living. One of the things that we found during the pandemic is that we had an increase in people calling about employment because they changed jobs after many, many years in many cases, and then were being asked for checks that hadn't been asked for before, and so we're seeing barriers there. So it's an ongoing thing. And just very quickly like to share a quote with you from a person with a criminal record, which I think is gets that message across. So, every role I've applied for always starts with embarrassment. I have a great interview and I go through all my experience and then have to disclose that I have a conviction for assault from when I was in school as a 14-year-old child. So this is repeating trauma, repeating barriers, and that person could be freed from that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Garrett.
Yes, afternoon, everyone. It's a question to Darren, really, thinking about some of the things that Timpson are doing. Particularly, your point earlier about how you're working with other employers and how sort of what the view is about the way that spent convictions, when they may be declared or when they show up. What's the sort of, in your experience, how do employers tend to see those?
Again, some of the points have been made earlier, but usually it's a lack of education on the employee's part, so they often jump to the most extreme conclusion. So when somebody does declare that they have an unspent conviction, they will assume wrongly that it's for something very, very serious and that individual is not going to be a good fit or kind of a safe prospect to join their business. Lots of other businesses we work with do use DBS checks, despite them not being regulated industries. And in the past, we've advised people to effectively stop hiding behind defunct and irrelevant HR policies and write a new policy which is more reflective of today's society. With that, there's between 12 and 30 million people in the UK with a conviction more serious than a driving offence. But it's certainly an issue for employers. And again, for me, it comes down to education. It comes down to these myths that are perpetuated in the media that ex-offenders have got nothing of value to add, that they're potentially dangerous, untrustworthy, dishonest, etc. What we do to overcome that is effectively show them positive examples of people who work within our business who are very credible, very professional. We take them to our in-prison training academy so they can meet people still serving sentences. We introduce them to colleagues who are working out for us on Rottle, and we make introductions to our partners in the New Futures Network and some of the other agencies that are here today who've all got lots of very credible people with an offending background as part of their organisations.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're describing is sort of an over-application of the precautionary principle, where there's a possible danger here. Let's just, give it the barge pole treatment rather than think intelligently about, like some of the example of a 14-year-old assault, which might, I don't know what that was, maybe in a playground scuffle or something. And I think with offending, with all sorts of criminal offences, it's quite nuanced, and you're quite right. I think people sort of use them broad brush strokes and it's not useful at all. So the example that was given then is something that we come across fairly frequently. Once somebody discloses or an offence is disclosed during a DBS check, particularly for a violent offence, no matter what the circumstances were, no matter what kind of state of mind that individual was in at the time, what was going on in their lives or how long ago it was, the decision usually by the employer will be too risky, we can't employ this person. So what we do is we go in and we ask people to have an honest and upfront discussion with any candidates, providing of course that the offence is disclosable and is still live and not spent, because otherwise employers are not lawfully allowed to ask about unspent convictions. Yeah. Interestingly, when we speak to employers, pretty much the number one thing they always say is that they can't find people. So it's quite an interesting context to this conversation. With the employment market being the way that it is that driving a big shift in curiosity, let's say? Is there a shift in people's willingness to consider people that they wouldn't have? Absolutely. So I've worked for Timpson now for 12 years, and a big part of my role, as I've said earlier, is to kind of convince other businesses to recruit from this cohort and the benefits both societally and commercially of employing prison leavers or people with convictions. And it's been a tough job because, again, people are effectively too risk averse. They don't trust people coming from prison or people with convictions. But given the kind of perfect storm of Brexit, the pandemic and the labour market being so buoyant, all of a sudden now we've got a huge queue of employees asking us for help. Please can you broker some introductions with the NFN? Please can you take us into a prison? Please can you help us develop a risk assessment? Please can we meet some of your ex-offenders? Please can you speak to our colleagues and do some myth busting with them? And it's working quite well. Arguably, some of these businesses aren't doing it for the right reasons. They're doing it because they've got vacancies, and quite frankly, they'll take anybody to fill them. But our view is that effectively it will move the agenda forward anyway, and it will result in the normalisation of ex-offenders in the workplace. So all in all, we think it's a good thing. Yeah, I tend to, as my personal view, if you do the right thing for the wrong reasons, that's better than not. You made an interesting comment earlier that that I wanted to follow up on. You mentioned about people. So there's the question about getting a job, and then as Duncan was talking about the keeping a job, which is equally difficult sometimes. And you talked about probation appointments being a challenge to that, and that struck me as interesting because obviously the job of the probation service is to help people rehabilitate from prison. and if they're a potential source of disruption in the life of the person resettling in employment. So I want to explore that a bit, and whether, because that might be a recommendation that we could make to the probation service to be more.
I think, to be fair, the criticism wasn't a probation. Probation, usually when somebody's in employment, are absolutely really happy for that and will support evening reporting or even weekend reporting or remote reporting. It's often a problem with employers. So, for example, if a prison leaver's got to report to probation every Wednesday at 12 o'clock, the employer will often say, well, we need you to work Wednesday. It gets in the way. But it's a problem that, for us, we can certainly overcome. Typically, with a phone call or an email to a probation officer, we will say, we've got this individual now working for us. Our expectation is they will work 5 or 6 days, including weekends. Please, can we switch to evening reporting? And we've never had any issues. But I think some employees would view that as an obstacle, really, but it's one that can be easily overcome.
Yeah, no, well, I suppose I'm just keen on eliminating every obstacle. So, you know, it does sound like so you're talking about the benefits of the employer being proactive and flexible. Yeah. But I suppose my question is, and I don't know whether this is something Duncan might want to comment on, why is the flexibility not happening automatically from the probation service, given that this is, you know, it sounds like they're sort of self-defeating. Perhaps I've misinterpreted the comment.
I think it depends when the individual starts work. So if you think about prison leavers, if prison leavers go through the gate, they will be offered a job. Depending on if it's a job working for Timpson, it will be retail. So typically they will work a Monday, Tuesday. They might have a Wednesday off, but they will work Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Now, if their first meeting with probation, when they get released from custody, their probation officer, due to their caseload and due to their schedule, may say, well, we need you to report at 12 o'clock every Tuesday. So instantly then you've got a conflict. But again, once that individual comes back to work and then says to us, my probation officer wants me to report every Tuesday, we can contact the probation officer and we can usually iron these issues out. But there will be that initial problem when people just get released from custody.
Fair enough. Okay. I don't want to unfairly I mean, there's no one here from probation. Well, I don't know whether you wanted to comment on that, Duncan. If that's something that comes up, or is that Darren's covered?
I think Darren's pretty much covered what I'd say. I think, and it's probably that first appointment after someone's got a job, and typically the probation officer would be flexible for that. But
good. Well, I'm glad we clarified that, because I didn't want to unfairly ding the probation service. The other question I wanted to ask, I don't know if this is for you, Darren, or maybe for anyone else. We spoke a bit earlier about the work readiness and sort of very basic skills, you know, turning up on time, properly presented, and reliably, and so on, which I understand. You know, I understand there's a very key things to retain any kind of job. Where are the opportunities for that kind of training? Because I mean, presumably as an employer, these are the kinds of things that you coach people on. So I mean, presumably these are challenges that you overcome. But are there opportunities elsewhere in the system where you think, well, actually, maybe while people are still in prison, maybe I hate to keep bringing the probation service, but you know, where in the system could that happen?
I think the obvious opportunity will come while people are still in custody and will work out on ROTL. ROTL gives people a structure, it gives them a real taste of the world of work, they're able to earn money and they're able to reintegrate safely and slowly back into society while still having lots of checks and balances in place. So for us, typically, when we employ somebody on ROTL, we will go in, we will interview them, risk assess them. They can work for us for up to 2 years while still in custody. When they get released, we offer them a full-time position. And obviously, during that 2 years, they've learned that kind of sustainability approach, really, in terms of you've got to turn up on time every day. It doesn't always work, because obviously when people are in custody, they've got to turn up at a certain time. As I said before, there's lots of rules, regulations, checks and balances, and when people get released, all these checks and balances are gone, or the vast majority anyway. So on the odd rare occasion, it will go wrong, because people will come out and unfortunately slip into old habits. But what we do then is we give people, by that time we've already built a rapport with people, so we're able to give them that degree of flexibility, we're able to talk to them because we've got that relationship with them, and we support them in that sort of crucial first few weeks when they leave custody.
I might just add to that if there's time.
Yes, please do.
I think there are a few different routes to getting people ready. One is a really good partnership with an employer where they put either their own work or their own training into a prison, so then building a relationship with the individuals. They're being really clear what they want from them. The people are turning up every day, and in the case of the Timpson workshop at Thorncross, doing work that is, you know, valuable for the company and so on. So that's this sort of part of the daily regime. Another would be particular courses that do give people skills, but also deal with their personal identity as well. So a good example of that would be Standout, a really excellent charity operate in London. Do lots about communication skills and all those things that are an aptitude, but they also sort of reach in a bit to talk about how people feel about what they've done and where they want to go and how they see themselves. And kind of get people emotionally ready for it as well. And one of the incredibly valuable things about that is they then continue the relationship with them through the gate as well. So there's that trust, accountability, support that continues all the way through. So I think work and or training in prison is great, but those type of courses that often that partners are doing in prisons make a big difference.
When you talk about personal identity, is that something a bit like, I mean, I'm picturing from what you said something a bit like an imposter syndrome of I'm this person with this criminal background, and I'm sort of masquerading as a regular employee within this company, and it's about helping people to understand that they're entitled to be there. And is that the sort of thing you mean?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of things. I think some of it is about taking responsibility for what's got you there, and then what you need to do separately. But then it's also about building up an individual to have the confidence to not self-select out of a job opportunity, to believe that if they do get an interview, they can do a good job, and that gives them more chance of persuading the employer as well. So I think, like most things, there's a kind of maybe a kind of tougher element of accountability alongside the support and encouragement too.
Okay, that's very useful. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We are going to move on to another area called the next subject area is going to be increasing employment opportunities for people who have had contact with the criminal justice system. I'm going to ask Assembly Member Sheikh just to do her questions on this now, and then we'll have a break after your questions.
Sounds good, Chair. Thank you. Good afternoon to the panel. It's good to hear from you. Just before I move on, I have two specific questions. I just actually really wanted to pick up on something you said, Darren, because it really interested me. You sort of said leaving prison is more traumatic than entering prison, and I was just wondering if you could expand on that in terms of why, and like sort of evidence-based, but also sort of the psychological analysis.
Yeah, so the reason we believe that is that we've employed hundreds of prisoners over the years, and we spend lots of time in custody actually speaking to people still serving custodial sentences. So I think the best way to explain it is obviously being sent to prison, very traumatic. People lose their liberty, they lose access to contact their family members, loved ones, etc. It's not a very nice environment, to be fair, and the whole shock of being sent to prison is huge. Prison's often described as a kind of dehumanising experience, and whilst it should be the place where people get better, often, unfortunately, it's not. But when people are due to be released from custody, particularly following a long prison sentence, often they become institutionalised, which means they effectively get told where to be, when to be there, what to eat, when to eat. They've got a sentence plan they must follow. So it's quite regimented, so that's how they become kind of institutionalised. And when they get released, often they've got to start their whole lives again. Usually relationships have broken down, accommodation has been lost, employment is a factor. That, coupled with the whole sort of getting back up to speed with modern society. We meet lifers on a regular basis when they went into prison. Their mobile phone was an old Nokia phone with a torch on it and the snake game. Now we're up to probably iPhone 14. If you need to see a GP, you've got to do it through an app. So people need that opportunity to come out, and it can be so daunting for them, particularly in the sort of early weeks and months when they get released from prison. That's why often they will reoffend and end up back in custody, because they'll rely on substances to kind of get them through those tough periods. But yeah, anecdotally, the individuals that we speak to in custody, when they've been released, say that it's often more traumatic than getting sentenced in the first place.
Thank you. I appreciate that analysis. So the question I had to the broader panel, and I think this sort of... there's a lot that's been said already this afternoon that I think covers, will probably cover in your answers, so feel free to draw on what's already been said. But does London have specific challenges or opportunities when it comes to employment opportunities for people who have had contact with the criminal justice system? Anyone want to start?
In the absence of anyone else, I will. So a couple of things. One would be the type of prisons you have in London. So Darren's mentioned ROTL, or release on temporary licence, day release for people, which is a great avenue for people to go out to work. That's not something the prisons that are in London offer, because they're closed prisons, category B or C typically. So it would be a category D prison, an open prison that does that. So that's just the nature of the type of prisons that are in London. In prison, the space in the kind of old Victorian prisons, there often isn't as much space as there might be in some other prisons around the country to have workshops and the type of work preparation that I was talking about. And I think, if my homework before coming here was correct, I'm right in saying that the employment rate in London generally is the unemployment rate slightly higher than the rest of the country anyway. So I guess there's some of that too. But it's looking at our figures, it is the case that employment outcomes for prison leavers are lower in London than they are nationally.
Thank you for that. Did anyone else want to come in on the challenges or opportunities that come with employment?
Well, I mean, I'll just add a challenge, if that's okay. I mean, that's very pertinent in the London context, which is, you know, many of the services we've described that are required by those either in prison or leaving prison to help them overcome those barriers are in short supply. Things like mental health services, things like substance misuse services, and in London that is more acute. I think the other thing to really point out is the criminal justice system in London is really struggling. So, you know, the Police and Crime Committee heard from probation recently, you know, they have 600 vacancies in London. So if we're, you know, similarly prison staff, a lot of challenge, you know, post-lockdown, we've still got examples of London prisons where there aren't enough staff to move people to the places where they might do, for example, some culturally competent conversations about, you know, their behaviour. So they're spending a lot more time in cells. You know, all of these things are contributing, and they are more acute in London. So we have less of the services we need because we have less of the people to deliver them, and less of the people to support people. So all of these things are real challenges that the whole system is working through at the moment. But you know, I mean, Assembly Member Garrett was talking about sort of turning up on time and things, which I'm not saying isn't important, but it's really hard to do that if you've still got a substance misuse problem. Or you still urgently need mental health services. And, you know, that's borne out, isn't it, by the fact that only 19% of offenders nationally are in what they call P45 employment a year after. That's 1 in 5. That's rubbish, isn't it?
I would agree, yeah. Thank you.
Could I possibly just come back really quickly to your first question, Sakina, to Darren?
Of course.
I'll be quick. So I completely recognise what Darren is describing there in terms of the institutionalisation and the sort of almost the kind of the comfort of the structure that's offered within prison. But I would have a caveat around women's experience in prison, because the rate of self-harm and suicide for women in prison is considerably higher than it is for men. Part of that is to do with what we've discussed earlier around mental health as legacy of childhood trauma. But a really big part of it is about separation from children as well, and the uncertainty of what is happening to your children, particularly if they've gone into the care system. They're being raised by strangers that you don't know. You've probably got no contact with your children. And if you're pregnant, giving birth in prison and having your baby taken away from you. So you can start to see why prison has a qualitatively different aspect for women than it does for men.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful to hear. If not, incredibly depressing. Did anyone offer any opportunities that they think are specific to London in terms of those who've had contact with the criminal justice system in their attempts for re-employment?
I think we've got a very vibrant criminal justice system, third sector in London. There is a lot of very good work going on, particularly with prison leavers, so that's not to be dismissed. I think those are the organisations we need to be looking at for good examples on how things are working, as well as employers who are demonstrating good practice as well. But I may sound like a little bit of a parrot here, but this isn't just about prison leavers. So it's all very well us being able to get people into jobs when they leave prison, but if 10, 15 years, 5 years later, they still face the same barriers through recruitment, because we haven't sort of educated employers properly, we haven't broken down those barriers and that stigma and discrimination, then, you know, we are just essentially setting people up to fail in the longer term. So there's just two sides to it. So that was good and bad, I think.
Thank you. I agree. Sort of the culture of changing the stigma is, I think, at the core of a lot of what you've all talked about in terms of overcoming the barriers. My sort of last question to the panel is, can you give examples of specific employers or employment practices in London which have helped people with criminal record to access employment?
Yes, I'll go quickly. So we work with over 100 employers around the UK, and many of them are in London. And I think I think there are two things that we'd particularly point to, which is flexibility on the employer's part, because, you know, we have in our sector, we have a mantra, see the person, not the offence. And employers who are able to do that, that's enormously helpful. And to think about, you know, to meet that candidate and look at their skills and their attributes and think, where could I fit this person into my company, rather than trying to match them to a particular role, is really, really helpful. And also being very clear about whether and when they want that candidate to disclose, so the candidate knows what they're going into. I think that's really helpful as well. And I've forgotten the other good thing about employers that I was going to say. So, and it's somebody else wants to come in.
And if there are any specific employers or best practices that you think are worth highlighting?
In London? I'm sure if my employment services team were here now, they'd be shouting names at me, and I can only think.
You could always follow up to the committee in writing afterwards.
You know, Timpsons, Greggs, Halfords are all over the place, you know, and the exemplars of best practice. Thames Water is an employer that we've found to be particularly flexible. Also, the company Curb, we've been incredibly impressed by, who do sort of food street markets, have been really, really flexible in terms of finding ways for the women that we work with to fit into their companies in a way that encourages retention, because if you put someone into a job that's not right for them, that's not supporting the likelihood of them staying in that role.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. It sounds like your team zapped over the knowledge in no time. Did anyone else on the panel, please?
Yeah, we do quite a lot of work with employers as well, so we come at both angles. We will challenge if individuals have phoned us and phoned the helpline and said, look, we don't think this is right, can you help us? But on the other hand, we want to encourage people, employers, to think about employment from equality, diversity, inclusion point, because that's what it's really about. It's about, you know, those fair chances, and we, you know, very much kind of asking people to think about whether they need to ask the questions. Do they need to know if someone has a criminal record or not? Is it relevant? And if they do know, when they can best ask people for that information, and to do that in a clear, transparent way, so people know up front what they're going to be asked, how they're going to be asked it, and the reason why. Or if they're not going to be asked, also, you know, it's very good to state that we don't ask for criminal records. So it's difficult to pull out lots of examples here, but certainly we've got various people who we've been working with over the years. One my team gave me here was worked with the old Vic around changing their policies and recruitment principles, so that they're more inclusive about people with criminal records, and we just do an awful lot of that. And we are hearing about employers coming together to start to make this change, particularly some of the bigger ones, but also I think it's important that these messages get out to smaller employers too. Locally, I have a cafe called Craving Coffee in Tottenham. Just bigging it up there, but anyway, so they have very inclusive policies, and they just did that anyway without any support or guidance, because they felt it was the right thing to do.
Amazing. And just to the whole panel, if there are examples afterwards that you wanted to follow up with the committee, please feel free to do so in writing.
I'll just very, very quickly add, if that's okay, a couple, just because they illustrate a point. One would be Green King, who've employed over 160 people now who were in prison. Another would be Pret a Manger, have typically done a lot in this area as well. And what they have in common is a dedicated scheme for people from various groups who might be at a disadvantage in the labour market, because one of the things they find is the same. This isn't to say that the groups are all exactly the same, but often the same sort of support is beneficial for people if they've been in prison, or perhaps there's a veterans programme. You're also dealing with issues of trauma, dislocation, family relationships coming back together, and so on. So I think when the larger companies had a chance to think through what some support looks like for that group, they get the confidence in it, and it spreads quickly around the country. Another thing quickly that you might want to consider is the public sector as well. So the civil service now has a dedicated scheme for people leaving prison called Going Forward into Employment, which is part of, you know, doing what you say. And then the last thing, just to echo Angela's point about the opportunity of the third sector in London. Back to what I said at the beginning about sustaining employment and having somebody with you, mentoring you, helping you deal with everyday challenges. The third sector is better placed than anybody to do that stuff. So organisations like Bounce Back, No Going Out, Stand Out, and many others that we can write to you about are doing lots of amazing work. So I think thinking about how you can work with them would be really fruitful.
That was really helpful. Thank you very much. And Darren, I don't know if you, of course
Just
you did.
really, really quickly, there's a couple of quite large employers. Duncan's mentioned most of them, but obviously Greg's, Cook, Pret, which Duncan's mentioned, Marston's, and Iceland as well, all doing some really, really good work, employing lots of ex-offenders, giving lots of opportunities.
No, it's brilliant. And I'll just wrap up by just sort of saying, so it sounded sort of like with yours, Darren, the examples you were using where organisations have specific programmes for ex-offenders, and you found that to be particularly helpful in the sense that I guess there's that kind of wider network support, and kind of, I wonder if it begins to kind of tackle that imposter syndrome that Assemblyman Garrett was talking about. So I just wondered if anyone on the panel wanted to comment specifically on whether they sort of agreed or disagreed with whether those specific programmes within organisations are a good idea.
They're definitely a good idea. So proactive schemes to recruit people with convictions are better, because then the employer thinks carefully about what they need to put in place and about how this sits within their diversity and inclusion approach, which is exactly where it should sit. And they think reflectively about, for example, who within the company needs to know which people have convictions, because that needs to be incredibly sensitively handled on a need-to-know basis. And then they think about what training they need to put in place for line managers, because of course people with convictions should be treated just like any other employee, but there will be occasions when they need particular support and particular sensitivity potentially, and the line manager needs to know what discretion they have there and what form that support might take.
Amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I just wanted to clarify something that I was listening to the employers that many of you are mentioning, and do correct me if I'm wrong, but there seems to be a connection between the types of businesses and employers, like a service type business. Am I right in thinking that that's the kind of businesses that are tending to be more open?
We work with every type of employer, so
Right.
kind of creative companies, tech companies, little kind of startups, absolutely every kind of company that you can think of. I'm not sure I would particularly identify a theme of what sort of company.
I'd say for us, it's typically skills shortage sectors.
Yeah.
So construction, retail, catering and hospitality.
I was picking up that kind of
logistics.
hospitality type of area
Yeah, logistics is another sector that was doing a lot and has skills shortage as well. So I think it's where there are entry-level jobs that people can take up and skills shortages typically.
Do you think we should be doing more there in terms of working a more kind of a wider area?
I suppose there's just one other
employment.
point, which is when you're working with a retail company, their networks are with retail companies, so you kind of naturally spread, and Timpson have done an amazing job of bringing others into and their networks are typically in that area as well. So sometimes when you break into a sector, that allows you to branch out, again, which I imagine you've experienced too.
I think the labour shortages are significant, and I think they're driving some of the change that we're seeing. But I think the other really important factor is the move towards companies understanding the need to demonstrate their social impact. So for big companies globally, they're completely clear they have to do that, just as they have to demonstrate their environmental impact. And all the research now is showing that particularly younger people, millennials and Gen Z particularly, want employers and want to buy from people that can demonstrate their social impact. So I think that's a key part of what is driving the change towards companies being more accepting of people.
Thank you. Well, that was a great start. Thank you so much. We're going to have a very short break just so that you can have a walk around, and we'll set our next questions in about 5 minutes' time, if that's okay. Great. Thank you.
Can we get out?
That's a good question.
Welcome back to the Economy Committee meeting, where we'll now move on to our next set of questions, and we're continuing on the topic of barriers to work for people who have had contact with the criminal justice system. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you all. That's been fascinating so far. And Natasha, I particularly want to amplify actually what you said about women and disproportionately being arrested for shoplifting and nappies, and the fact that we're criminalising poverty. And I just wanted to repeat it really, because I think it's an important thing to be said in this chamber and for people to know. And Darren, I used to work in the prison service, so I know from working with people how much Timpson and the work that they're doing is appreciated. And also I often hear Halford's mentioned, and I know that lots of other organisations have been mentioned, but those are my comments. I'll get to actual questions. Duncan, what has the impact of the New Futures Network work been on helping prison leavers find employment?
One day I'll remember to put that on. So employment, we were established in late 2018 in 3 pilot areas. We had national coverage across England and Wales by January 2022, just in time for the pandemic. So I think it might just be worth just explaining what we do, and then I'll talk about how things. So we essentially have 2 different types of roles. One is to go and meet employers to persuade them that they should consider employing people from this group and provide work in prison and on release, and work with them over to guide them through the process. It's the staff in the prisons who identify who might be put forward to be interviewed, for example, but we'll go and make the connections on behalf of the prison. So that's one half of what we do. The other half is trying to get the employment system in HMPPS working well, so identifying good practice, spreading it more widely, and I could talk about some of the things we've been doing there with the help of some money from the recent spending review, and running some national programmes as well. So the National Prisoner Banking Programme and the National ID Programme to address some of those barriers I mentioned earlier. There's lots going on the kind of system side that I'll quickly touch on if that's useful and not taking up too much of your time. Over the last, we've learnt a lot since we started. I think it's fair to say we had a lot of success going and finding employers and bringing them to work with prisons, but we quickly realised that we had to address the systems, processes, incentives and staffing in prisons so that we were making the most, we HMPPS were making the most of those opportunities. So in the last 18 months, we've made a series of changes. One is, with the help of the Timpson Foundation in particular, we've been setting up an employment advisory board for for each of 92 prisons. So they all have a business person who chairs the board. It meets quarterly with the governor and their staff, has other employers on it, typically third sector partners often, Department for Work and Pensions, and it sets the strategy for employment for that prison, and helps raise it as a priority. That's part of changing the culture of prisons, I think. And a related thing is prisons are now judged much more. Well, for the first time ever, they were judged in 2019-20 on the proportion of people going into employment after release. So before it was all about purposeful activity within the prison, but less about or not at all about the outcome afterwards. So prisons have businesses advising them, different accountability. They also have some new staff, which is important to make the most of the opportunities when they come in from an employer. So those 92 prisons now also have a prison employment lead, who isn't part of my team, but they work with the opportunities that we and others would take in to them as well. So their role is to understand who's leaving in the next 12 weeks, what their skills and interests are, where they're going to be released to, whether they have an ID and a bank account, whether they're actually ready or not, to work with probation to understand any risk or licence conditions that might affect someone's employment. And they also have an ID and banking administrator who covers their programmes I talked about as well. The other quick thing that I'll mention is having an identifiable place in each of those 92 prisons that you, as a man or woman serving a sentence in there, can go for support, and where different agencies can work with one another. That often didn't exist before, so we've been putting employment hubs into prisons. So you can make an appointment there, and when you're there, that's a chance to see the Department for Work and Pensions prison work coach, who can advise you on jobs, but also access to universal credit, which of course is a gateway to other types of employment support. You can get your careers advice from the information advice and guidance team, meet the prison deployment lead and talk to them about job opportunities. So it's one place where different agencies can come together. So I think, to come back to your question, I think we've been part of, but not the only part of, because I've talked about the other partners, including those on this panel, who've made a big difference to employer attitudes. We've helped get the systems in place that I think are starting to make a difference on the proportion of people going into employment. So, as has been mentioned, the proportion of people into work is still far too low. We want it to be much higher, but it's been rising. So at 6 months, nationally it was 14% of people in 2021. It was up to 17.52% in 21-22. And some of the more, there's been an ad hoc stat that I can write, statistics release that I can share with the committee afterwards, which has shown an upward trend in more recent months as well. So I think the systems are coming together, and we and many other organisations are starting to make a dent with the help of the employers who are offering the actual opportunities.
Thank you. That was really well put. Can I just ask you on ID? Is any work being done particularly around voting with the rules changing for prisoners to be able to make sure they have ID when they come out of prison?
Yeah, so as part of release planning, to give you an example, it wasn't a London prison, but I was in a prison last week, HMP Risley. They have a 12-week pre-release board. So if you're leaving in 12 weeks, you sit down and there's various partners come together and plan for your release. One of the things they check, well, two of the things they check are, have you got a bank account and do you have ID? So birth certificate and other forms of ID. If you don't, they've got a staff member who can administrate that for you because there isn't access to the internet and so on, and a fund to buy that ID as well. So we're also been working with the DVLA on a process with them where people can get a replacement driving licence or a provisional driving licence, which isn't right to work ID but is photographic ID. So it's not specifically with that in mind, but it will.
That makes sense. And then could I ask you about digital upskilling? In what ways prisons could help that aspect of the UK workforce?
Yeah. So obviously there are lots of security and risk considerations in prisons that colleagues in security teams have to think about. There is some digital access that people have in prison. There's a platform called Virtual Campus, which is, if you're in university, there might be an intranet or at work, so it's similar to that, where you can't head out into the wider internet, but you can access a range of content. That's accessed normally in education suites with education via the education provider who staffs it. We're looking at making better use of digital technology in our team as well, so having a digital jobs board as part of that virtual campus platform that we and lots of other partners, I hope, can advertise their jobs. The benefit of that being, rather than going into an employment hub and looking up on the wall, you're using the type of skills you're going to need to use on release to search for jobs, filter the things you're after, put your digital CV forward and so on. So I think we're making steps in that direction. We're also interested in making better use of video technology. The pandemic, I think, taught HMPPS a lot about how we can and can't use technology. So video calls were done with families, for example, when family visits stopped. And I think some of the more experienced and confident employers might be interested in doing video interviews, for example, possibly as a second interview when they've met somebody. So I think we know we need to move as much as we can with the times, accepting the security challenges that a prison service faces.
Thank you. And could you tell us specifically about Code 4000 and what the impact of initiatives like this have been?
Yeah. So Code 4000, another charity, another really valuable partner. They teach people to code in prisons and have helped people into employment in some quite high-profile organisations afterwards. Banks, for example, I think people have gone on to work for. That you're not actually online when you're learning to code in a Code 4000 training centre in a prison. You're essentially working in a kind of downloaded offline space, but it feels as if you're, for all intents and purposes, you are online. So you're picking up coding skills, but you don't have full internet access. I think things like that are great because they're a flagship for higher skilled jobs and a demonstration that people who are in prison can go into them. Obviously, you need a certain investment to achieve those things, the computers, all the security around it and so on. But they are a valuable partner, and we're keen to do more of that kind of training.
Thank you. Angela, if I can turn to you, what are the best ways that prisons can equip prisoners before they leave with the skills and experience that they need to enter the job market?
Well, I think we've sort of talked quite a lot about that during it, but from an unlock point of view, it's very important that people know what they need to disclose, how long they need to disclose it before they're released. And there's a lot to think about when you're leaving prison, and sometimes that is picked up and sometimes it's not. We have a helpline which people in prison can phone for free. It doesn't cost them anything to do that, to ask those questions. But then when people are released, they can also get that information directly from us by phoning us or via our website. We have something called the disclosure calculator, which you can input your convictions and when they were, and it will tell you what your position is at any given time, because that changes and moves on. But we know it's been a bit of a postcode lottery, really, in terms of what people know, what information that they get before they leave prison, and so when they come out, people don't always know, and it can cause problems for them further down the line if they're not disclosing when they're supposed to.
It makes sense. This might be something you're able to speak to, but if not, don't feel the pressure. Green Start is a new green construction skills training programme in HMP Forest Bank in Manchester. I don't know if you know of other places that are working to kind of upskill people, particularly in green skills. We've talked about the digital, but actually in those practical skills that we know the economy desperately needs, as well as the digital skills.
I don't, but if anybody else does, I'd love to hear more about it too.
Would anyone like to take that one? Duncan, you sound like you've been nominated.
I've been nominated, yeah. So recycling is actually another area of that is quite a significant industry that provides work in prisons. So there's a charity called Recycling Lives, who are connected to the business of that name. They bring various bits of TVs and other equipment into prisons, which are taken apart and recycled. The charity then does an amazing job supporting those people into jobs after release, and as I was talking about earlier, mentoring and supporting them all the way through as well. So recycling would be another one. There are bits of agriculture and horticulture within the prison estates as well, so this is often less with an external employer, but sometimes the prison growing food that is then cooked in the kitchens. So there are bits of work that's done for the prison service itself that might fall under that category as well.
That's really interesting. I think it was Assembly Member Garrett before that said about employers often tell us that there's not people at the moment to employ things, and we know in London there's a retrofit gap in terms of people skilled to retrofit things, so it sounds like there might be some joining the dots to be doing in this sector. Will, if I can just finish with you briefly, you talked about care leavers earlier on, obviously a different subject to people leaving prison, but there is a big sad overlap. One thing the Welsh Government are doing are a basic income pilot with care leavers. Is that something you would be interested to see in London, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, care leavers are care experience young people. Sorry, I should use the correct term. I used to be a children's services leader, so I should use the right term. Are disproportionately affected all over the shop, frankly. So I know that really positive things have happened. For example, council tax exemptions. There's a range of kind of grants available. I think it's all really positive, but there's whatever we can do for that group, we should be doing. I think it's our sort of civic responsibility, really. And I know there are, we talk to the DfE a lot about this on other matters, but there's this concept of being a corporate parent, and the local authority is the corporate parent. There's a move, and I think it's one I support, that definition should be broadened out, and more of the public sector should be seen as a corporate parent, not just the local authority. If the state is looking after someone, I think we all have a responsibility to it. So UBI might be one way to do it. I think there are other ways to do it, but yeah, absolutely. Anything for that group isn't too much.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, something I'm really glad you mentioned the care leavers, actually. That's a really important point. I just wanted to pick up on something that Angela said about the postcode lottery and knowledge. Can you just explain to me why that's happening and where that's happening exactly? Is this a London issue?
I think this is a sort of a system-wide issue, really, partly because of the way prisons operate, because essentially, although from the outside you're going to prison, you expect things to be joined up and everything to be the same. It's not always the case, and often very much it's prison-led as to what's happening there, who is commissioned, contracted to do pieces of work in the prison, and how that is rolled out. So it's a fairly scattergun.
Thank you for that. I mean, if there's anyone who wants to add anything more on that, then we'll move on then. Assembly Member Bailey, you're next.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, panel. Can I start with Angela, please? I just want to quickly talk about, can you provide me with an update to the progress and the achievements of the Ban the Box campaign? You're 10 years out from your launch. What employers in London have signed up to the campaign? And have you had any contact with the GLA about signing up?
I can absolutely update you. So 10 years on, just to say that the campaign doesn't sit with Unlock anymore. It sits with Business in the Community, but I can give you a bit of an update on it. So at the moment there are a total of 150 employers signed up to Ban the Box, and some of those in London, so it's a very kind of a broad range, really. We were saying earlier are the specific sectors, but just to name some, we've got Accenture, BNP Paribas, Lloyds Banking Group, South Bank Centre, Thames Water, Redemption Roasters. There's also a lot of construction companies, etc., and third sector organisations in the mix there, some creative organisations. So it's quite broad. And in terms of business in the community, their approach is really putting it with sort of equality, diversity and inclusion, and it sits within their inclusive employment, inclusive recruitment programme at the moment called Opening Doors, and that looks at a number of different factors that are barriers perhaps to people getting employment, so not just criminal records but also things like disability, etc. So it's in there, but from an Unlock point of view, one of the big things that Ban the Box has done is opened up that conversation. We're all sitting here now talking about some of the great work that employers are doing and their perspectives and how they have changed over the years, and that's because of things like Ban the Box. It's a touch point, it's a starting point, because just banning the box isn't the answer. It's good, it's kind of puts it on the table, but if you don't think through your policies and procedures and how open you're being with people about whether you will ask further down the line, you're just shoving it up. So you could have someone who gets through to an interview and then discloses a conviction which you're automatically going to reject them for. So it's better to be very clear and upfront with people. Have good policies, be inclusive, and have those conversations within staff teams, within management, within HR, etc., as to what your position as an organisation is, and be clear about that.
Thank you for that, because when you look at this list, about 130 organisations still ask the question at some other point. So where in your negotiation with them are you having that conversation? Because it shows that a business is going to ask the conversation. Ask the question, excuse me. Do you believe, are you trying to get beyond the question being asked at all, or are you trying to get it asked in a uniform way, or is it linked to the industry and the type of work that's being offered?
It is linked to the industry and type of work. So as mentioned before, there are certain convictions that people have which they have to disclose if asked, so they're required to do that. So in terms of for safeguarding, for work with children and young people, and for vulnerable adults, that's important. But it's for those regulated professions, for those things where that has to happen, being upfront about it and saying, look, this is this type of job, we will be asking this at some point during the line. We're not necessarily going to ask it straight up, but consider the consequences of that, really. We want to judge people on their skills and their abilities and their experiences and the great things that they bring to a role first, but obviously being clear as to when there might be checks that have to be done. In terms of basic checks, however, I think, we want to say to employers, stop and ask if you need to ask this. Is it relevant to the role? Why are you asking this? Is it relevant? And I think there is a very good argument for saying that most basic checks aren't that relevant anymore.
Do you have any idea? Earlier on in the conversation, you made a comment that non-regulated industries are still asking the question. Do you have any idea what's driving that? Why are they asking the question? Because if I run one of those non-regulated industries, it's just another headache for me that I could have avoided. So why would I ask the question?
Honestly, I think some people use it as a screening tool. Businesses have a lot of people applying to jobs these days. It's easier just to weed out a set of people without thinking through that they're people. They kind of take this view, well, we're not going to have anyone with a criminal record. It's a lack of knowledge, it's ignorance, it's not seeing people as a person. So there's that side of things. And then there are people who think they actually have to ask because, they're entitled to ask, but they don't have to. And often that is misinterpreted as having to ask.
Oh, that's an interesting response. But isn't there also businesses that are still doing good work in this space, who are employing people, who are setting up schemes, but haven't signed up to the Ban the Box?
Absolutely. So Ban the Box is a tool. It's like a badge. For example, it guides people into a way of doing things, and it does showcase the issue. However, I would rather people are just, if people are just doing it, then that's great, because that's a positive result for the people with criminal records who are applying for jobs with those companies. And we'd love more people to be shouting out about it, because it does help to change the narrative around it. But, particularly, that's not always the right thing for all organisations.
And just, thank you for that as well. Just to help me here with this, the differentiation between unspent and spent, would the campaign be easier to sell if it was only asking around unspent convictions? If it wasn't saying, because if to the layperson, which unfortunately most people you seem to be dealing with seem to be that way, it seems like it's asking for all convictions not to be disclosed. Would it be more powerful if it just asked for unspent?
Well, it goes back to depending on what the job is, and it is quite a complicated system, and we all know that. But if you are an employer, you may have some jobs that you're going to have to ask people to disclose for because of the regulations, and because you legally have to, and others that you don't. So I think about banning the box is about asking people to disclose. So saying that, in the first instance, we are going to give you the opportunity to tell us why you'll be great about this job. That's the most important thing. We want to see that from you. And then, in this particular role, we might ask, but we're going to tell you if we're going to ask first, so you can make an informed decision about whether to apply for that job or not.
Okay, thank you. What further action?
Assembly Member Bailey, can we have a question from Assembly Member Sheikh on Ban the Box, please?
Away you go.
Thank you. Yeah, Angela, it was about your conversations with the GLA about signing up to Ban the Box.
I can't answer that one, I'm sorry. It may have happened earlier on, or business in the community may have had those conversations, but they weren't from us. However, us at Unlock would be really happy to talk to the GLA about any of these issues that we've discussed today and how we can support more inclusive policies.
That's great, thank you. Will, have you been privy to any of the conversations around the GLA signing up to Ban the Box?
I haven't actually, but what I would say is, I can speak from a MOPAC perspective, which is obviously we are police staff, and lots of are technically, so we have to go through a full vetting. Lots of our staff have access to Met systems. However, the VRU, which MOPAC hosts, clearly the Violence Reduction Unit needs people in it who have experiences of the types of communities, the types of issues that they're looking to prevent. So there are ways to get around it, and we know, I don't obviously want to keep people's confidentiality, but clearly if we're going to have people who represent the communities that we want to help and empower to support themselves to, in those aims of the VRU, we need those people. So there are, well, I suppose what I'm saying is there is scope I know there is scope within the GLA to employ people who would have to disclose.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I might just add to that, because of the information I've got here, I'm just going to read it out for accuracy. So the GLA policy is that when you apply, you will be asked to disclose details of all criminal convictions, cautions or bind-over orders that are not spent. This information does not form any part of the selection process. Only at conditional offer stage is the information provided in this section reviewed, and only those deemed relevant to the appointment will be considered. So obviously we won't be able to answer from the whole GLA perspective, but then just coming back to MOPAC, what types of roles would this information be considered for? So you've spoken about it in the context of the violence reduction unit in terms of it being a benefit, but if there's other aspects in terms of when it would be considered as a disadvantage.
I mean, that's right. I mean, that sounds like quite a sensible policy from the GLA. I mean, I suppose, though, to go to the ban the box, which I think is brilliant, is why ask it up front? Why not just ask it later? You know, wouldn't you say?
I would say that you need to look at roles individually and ask if that role particularly is going to create any need to ask for that. So I'd say having that blanket across the board is slightly something that could be looked at, but equally where you do have to ask, and you are going to, being upfront about it, and then having processes in place to make it as easy for someone as possible to actually to do that disclosure, and so it is handled confidentially and it only goes as far as it needs to go, and it's sensitive, so because people will often have had to repeat these stories multiple times.
Thank you. Just before I hand back to the chair, so back to you, Will, in terms of roles specific, where do you think, which roles for instance do you think that disclosure is particularly important for?
So I mean, look, as I say, it's really tough at MOPAC because we are police staff technically, and MOPAC has offices which are in Newlands Park, which is an operational police station. So there is a particular challenge, around MOPAC staff. We also have to have access to the police system called Aware to do things like access our pay slips and approve purchase orders and things. That presents a challenge, and you know, I don't want to sort of open up the vetting debate today, but you know, clearly that's a sort of live issue where we're suggesting the vetting should go further. So, I mean, MOPAC's a bit of a special case. What we're able to do, however, is for certain staff where they're not going to have access to that systems, and we know they're not going to have access to those systems. You know, because it's the police system that's the barrier here, and the police building that's the barrier here. So where they're not going to have access to those systems, and where we know that they won't need them, you know, in the course of their job, we found ways to sort of agree that actually, on the balance of risk, they don't need the full police vetting, because you know, if you're an ex-offender, you're unlikely to pass police vetting.
Is that a formal process, or is it done on a
role by role basis? You know, role by role basis. I've got to be honest. The default position is full vet for MOPAC roles. And that's just, you know, as I say, purely because, you know, we are police staff. My paycheck says MPS on it, it doesn't say GLA.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'm glad that you raised this. Angela, just before we go back to Assembly Member Bailey, we were at a FREP meeting recently where the London Fire Brigade said that they could only do a simple DBS check, nothing else. If they could do further checks, would that help them? I know this sounds a bit... There is a reason for this, but they could do more of a nuanced approach in the way they employ people, so that they could find out that this particular person may have... And if you did a DBS check, they would be like, no, you can't do it. But if they did more further investigation, if they had a higher level of vetting, for example, they could find a more sophisticated way of looking into somebody's convictions or cautions or whatever it was that may have been flagged by DBS, and therefore say, well, actually, this person was only misbehaving as a 14-year-old, for example, but could be a great firefighter. Is that something... it's an interesting area that I really kind of want to dive into.
It is an interesting area, and this has been flagged to me lately. So I think from our perspective, it is down again to this point. Well, which of the roles within that is it relevant for? What risk is it going to cause of you asking or doing high level of checks or not? Will that bring any benefit? And it might be that there are some roles that will fit for. And I know that the DBS is at the moment looking at a number of different sort of whether a number of different types of professions, such as firefighting, should be able to have higher level checks, but it doesn't really feel like there's a very robust system around that. It's like kind of people can just request it, and they built up over time. I think it's fairly nuanced, but actually, if you don't, you only ask a basic check, you've got someone in that role who hasn't got an unspent who doesn't have an unspent conviction, then what's the difference? Why not just employ them? And it may be that there have been things that have come up that have triggered this. I don't know about that, but in general, I would say it's not needed.
Could I come in really briefly on that?
Absolutely.
Is that okay? Thank you. So if they were permitted or encouraged to do a standard or enhanced check as opposed to a basic one, as Andrew's saying there, they would find out about spent convictions, which flies in the face of logic and the whole kind of intention of having spent convictions, because a spent conviction means that your record is wiped clean. It's expunged from the record, and nobody needs to know, and you legally don't have to declare it. So I would really worry about more employers having access to spent convictions. And also, just as an employer, when you get back that DBS result, and I know this as an employer, and you look at it, and you just see the bald fact of the offence and the date, it can be really scary without the context of what was going on in that person's life and what exactly happened and who did they commit this assault against, and was it in a domestic violence relationship, was it when they were a child and there was a ruckus in a children's home. You just don't have any of that context that you get from having that conversation with the human being about what was going on in their life. So I do worry about more employers doing higher level checks for those reasons.
Yeah, and I think what we were told in this case, it was so that more firefighters could go into schools, but I would expect if they were going into schools that they wouldn't be unsupervised anyway.
Yeah, but
Assembly Member Bailey.
Ultimately, it comes down to what the organisation's policy is, because I used to run a rather large youth work charity, and we would take people with convictions, and my trustees would say, we need to stay in our job applications. We will consider you if you have convictions. There's certain kinds of convictions we cannot consider for legal reasons, but other convictions we will consider, and that gave people the courage to then apply, and we'd have a conversation very early on and say, look, that's going to work. As a job advert said, this doesn't fly, I'm sorry, and we get into it. And that's why I'm with you, but I don't think the more enhanced, too much information in that context is not always useful, because as you say, that DBS form, there's a black magic in that. When you read it on there, it's true, you start thinking, well, if something goes wrong and this gets into the press, we're all for the high jump. And trustees tend not to like the high jump. Anyway, where was I? What further action would you like to see the Mayor and the government and civil society do to support ex-offenders to find suitable employment? If I start off at Angela, and then we can go slightly broader.
Absolutely. Well, obviously, we've got big asks around reform, but in the meantime, we'd really like to see people publicly supporting and lobbying for more inclusive recruitment across the board, and challenging that very negative language and stereotypes about people with criminal records. So you'll probably hear me repeatedly using the term people with criminal records, because it's about a person, and that's at the heart of it. Leading by example around introducing fair chance recruitment practices and principles is a really kind of big one that can be done relatively easily, and providing kind of support and guidance in respect of what best practice actually looks like. So and there's something around contracting as well, so mayoral contracts or funding to encourage inclusive recruitment to contractors, to funded organisations as well. So asking them to have those kind of robust policies in place can actually help, so that we know what they're doing, or what they're doing around collecting and processing information about criminal records. And finally, really, one of the big issues which we haven't really touched on today is that although it's unlawful for employers to knowingly ask for a check at the wrong level, there isn't really much teeth around the legislation to enforce this. It's just not something that happens. So and it sits on both the Ministry of Justice side, but also within the Information Commissioner's remit. But there aren't really any consequences, so we need to look towards encouraging employers at the same time, but stick and carrot kind of thing. We need there to be a bit more teeth there.
Just two short questions. Could the Mayor or one of the various government departments, but specifically the Mayor, be involved in giving prisoners who are about to be released more information? Because this idea around what you have to disclose or not is very important to your confidence to bother applying in the first place.
So I mean, basic information is really important. Where to get that advice and help, because it will change over time, and also sort of the support around the sort of things that other organisations already do around how to disclose as well, so that you're not doing it in a way that kind of puts you on the back foot.
Is that a piece of work MOPAC could fund or support?
So I mean, I think the honest answer to that is I don't think it's our place to. I mean, I think the statutory responsibility for this work sits with the MOJ. It sits with the DWP. I think MOPAC, our approach to this is we don't commission ETE work on its own. We don't commission things to do with employment on its own because, frankly, we think it doesn't work. So where I think it is helpful is where we're looking at specific groups and commissioning holistically around them. So where MOPAC, and we're working in our discretionary space here, where MOPAC's looking to work is, for example, our Women's Co-Commission Service with probation. That's a place where we have specific ETE support, which is delivered by Advance for women, because we understand their specific needs. And we know that works because it's wrapped around another provision. Similarly, the Youth to Adult Transitions Hub, we know that 18 to 25-year-olds have a particular issue, and we know that 17-year-olds transitioning have a particular issue. So we have our own ET provision within that, but that's within mentoring, within substance misuse, within mental health. So I think that's really MOPAC's role. I mean, I think what I see my role as, for example, as chair of the Reducing Reoffending Board in London, is to highlight that is a service that should be provided by HMPPS. I mean, we have one of the most punitive, let's not beat around the bush here, the most punitive criminal record systems in the world here. We talked earlier about some of those disclosures, 8,000 of the disclosures of the 23,000 DBSs last year where there were disclosures, more than a decade old. I mean, these are the things that are really challenging, and I've got to be honest, I don't think it's the Mayor's responsibility.
I tell you why I asked the question, because with the Violence Reduction Unit, the goal is to keep Londoners safe. We can all agree around this table that reoffending is a huge problem, and if you could solve some of that would keep Londoners safe. And to support a third sector organisation to do this small piece of work could have a significant impact on reoffending. And of course, when you look at reoffending, it's certain communities that suffer from high levels of reoffending and the impact of that. So I don't believe it's beyond MOPAC's remit, particularly as MOPAC has huge underspends often, and it wouldn't be a piece of work that MOPAC would do, rather MOPAC would commission. And I think it would be something really worth looking at, because people's access to employment has massive positive effects beyond just the fact that they make some money, and positive in where MOPAC needs to succeed, which is reoffending.
I mean, we've got a massive reoffending strategy, Assembly Member Bailey, that I'm happy to talk about another time. For me, we've got specific ETE services which are commissioned by probation, run by a company called Maximus, that work with ex-offenders through the probation service. So that's tied in with everything else probation are doing. It feels to me like it's the responsibility of that service, who's already working with ex-offenders, to explain what they can and can't disclose. And Duncan may be able to talk more about that. In prisons, each prison has a prison employment leave that links to and again, I think preparing people for release and employment from prison is the responsibility of prison. What I want to do is make sure that happens, and what I want to do is work with my colleagues, who's Director of London Prisons, to make sure that they have the resources they need to carry out their function. And at the moment they don't. I mean, I know I said that earlier, but it's a massive problem. London isn't getting access to the resources it needs right now. And it's a big problem in prisons, and it's a big problem in probation.
Look, we
so
could
those
always
are
ask
the
for
bigger
more.
issues for me. I mean, I suppose I just don't think a standalone service.
No. I'm not asking
I
for a
think the evidence
standalone.
base suggests, unfortunately, that might not be
I'm
successful.
not
I think
asking
it's
you.
well-intentioned.
I'm not asking you to set up and have a standalone service. I get the complication and cost. I'm asking you to ask the question because in all of this, information is key, and there is many people who are leaving prison now. That little bit of information could make all the difference. Or like I say, I used to run a youth work program. I used to deal with lots of people in and out of prison, and we spent a lot of our time just trying to get the answers. If somebody could provide some of those answers, it would lead to a lot less drama. And you've said that you've already commissioned someone to do this kind of work. Just ask them the question, are they providing that particular thing around disclosure? I think would be powerful.
Sure, no, absolutely, and apologies if I've slightly misunderstood what you were asking. So, you know, the provider that we have in the transitions hub, for example, absolutely provides that advice. The provider we have working in our women's service for women offenders in London absolutely provides that advice. You know, and I suppose what I was saying is my expectation is that the other providers, which are commissioned by HMPPS, would be providing that advice. What I think could I offer to look into this and to check with those providers. Check with the people I mentioned, the prison employment leads, check with Maximus, who are HMPPS's provider, and just make sure that this information is readily available to people who are under their supervision, and come back to you and tell you where it's available. And if it isn't, I'll undertake to put some pressure on to make it happen.
I'd really appreciate that. I'm not trying to make trouble. I just understand. I used to run a job club, and I've sat in front of people, and the first thing they say is, Sean, they're not going to take me because of any convictions. And if they believe that to be true, then there's not much else of a conversation after that.
I was just going to offer as well to work with you on that. I think lots of our prison employment leads are quite new, so we're busy training them up. We're doing it with a group of them in the north tomorrow, and we're doing it in the south. We get them together quarterly, so if we can make use of your resources, we'd love to, and completely acknowledge our responsibility as well to both manage both the kind of technicality and legal aspect of it, but also equipping people to disclose effectively, so give the context around their advice.
Thank you both, because this is the kind of real effect that the chair really likes the committee to have. Let me just move on and start on Natasha now. What has been the impact of the Mayor's Blueprint for Women initiative been on securing employment and opportunities for women with criminal records? And I just want to add an addition to that as well. Do you think the private sector, is too focused on the outcome of men, and that's made women's outcomes less of a priority?
When you say the private sector, do you mean employers?
Yes, and I mean all of this space. Are we focusing on men because they're the biggest part of the criminal justice system in sheer numbers terms?
Yeah, absolutely, definitely that is the case, Sean, and the whole criminal justice system was designed for men. Of course, women form a disproportionately small section of the prison population. But as I've said before, their issues are different. Most of them shouldn't be in prison. It's not the right answer. It doesn't prevent reoffending. So, we need to have a gender-informed kind of gender-specific approach to those women. So, yes, I would completely agree with you. So what was the other part of the question?
The blueprint.
The blueprint,
yes.
yeah. So I think where the blueprint has been particularly helpful is pulling together and understanding the enormous range of fantastic practice that is out there in London across all the different sectors, and really, really good work being done. I think the thing that stands out for me is the blueprint's appreciation of the significance of homelessness for women going into prison and leaving prison, and the fact that if you don't have safe and stable accommodation, you're not going to get employment, you're not going to get all the other good life outcomes that we want to secure for people who've been in prison. So the Women Leaving Prison Practice Briefing that the Blueprint Group has created is a really, really excellent piece of work. Pulled together by a lot of partners. I think the key now is to make sure that the communication and implementation plan for that is really strong. I'm not quite sure whether or not that work started, but like with every fantastic report, it's no good if it's sitting on a shelf, is it? It's got to get out to prisons, local authorities, housing providers, if it's actually going to be put into practice.
Okay. Can I just take us back slightly to a comment that you made earlier about short sentences? I also have done some campaigning around the uselessness of short sentences. But do you feel that magistrates, do they have enough training? Are they handing these out willy-nilly, or is it as a last resort?
I'm completely certain that they believe they're doing the right thing. I think one of the issues there is that they don't have sufficient confidence in the ability of community sentences to rehabilitate and to prevent reoffending. So I think, I'm not sure if I can bear this out in terms of evidence, but it'd be great to see some research commissioned around magistrates' attitudes and asking them what would increase their confidence. But I think sometimes there might be a part of that sort of punitive attitude that, you know, if Will has talked about how punitive the British criminal justice system is, the English media, the English public generally have a very punitive attitude to people who commit crime rather than a rehabilitative one. So I think that there are magistrates who think, well, you know, you've done this bad thing, you need to be punished, you need to be seen to be punished, the public want you to be punished, and I don't see evidence that that will be achieved by a community sentence. So I think we need to work with the magistrates, shall we say, to understand how we can increase their confidence and explain what is involved in a community sentence and why the rehabilitative elements of a community sentence have to be in place and are completely vital, particularly around drugs and alcohol, and how that then leads on to reducing reoffending.
Okay, thank you for that. And one quick thing to Duncan and anybody else on the panel. The other part that really interested me this afternoon about the conversation has been work preparedness. Because again, when you work in youth work, you see a lot of young people who might not be able to sustain a job straight away. Do we feel that we are using the adult education budget and all the other levers the Mayor has to support that work more? Could we do more in that space?
That's a good question. I probably don't have as much knowledge as that as I'd like to help you with that. I mean, I can talk better about what we do in prisons, but I know that's not really what you're asking for. People, when they go out on release on temporary licence, can access that community provision, but that's a very small minority. So primarily HMPPS funds a mainstream education budget in prisons, which is doing English, maths, basic IT and other things that the governor decides they want to commission that commissioning year, so construction course or whatever it might be. And then there's a flexible budget in prisons where they can do more smaller pieces of work. So, but I'd have less contact with the FE sector, I'm afraid.
Well,
I mean, I can talk to the adult education budget if that's helpful. So, unfortunately, the devolved adult education budget, which goes to my GLA colleagues, over which the Mayor has full control, doesn't include any funding for offender learning in custody. All of that's under the jurisdiction of the MOJ. So I'll leave the committee to come to a view about whether you think that's good news or not. But what the Mayor has managed to do is still support things in addition to those MOJ programmes, and we're really grateful at MOPAC because this is done by our GLA colleagues. Example of that, like the Skills for Londoners Capital Fund, employment-focused learning in 2 of London's prisons. So you might remember the Bad Boys Bakery in Brixton, yep. Nick. Sorry, I shouldn't say Nick. I've been there recently. It's too colloquial. Apologies. HMP Brixton. HMPPS colleagues will tell me off. Also the Escape Cafe at Wormwood Scrubs, which I was at a couple of weeks ago, which is pretty awesome. There's also $2 million which has been put aside from the adult education budget and ESF specifically for ex-offenders into education, training and employment from the Mayor, which I think is brilliant.
That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. I accept your point about who controls budgets inside prison. I'm saying is because I'm not maybe not even asking for extra money. It might just be more signposted when you're released. Yeah. Or when you're released from prison, is someone saying to you, you can access some of the training that happens in London? Is that part of the information that's been provided?
So the specialist providers that work with probation, who are called Maximus, are supposed to be doing that. And then what the Mayor is doing is then providing additional funding from where he can in the adult education budget to try and top some of this up. The other thing is, I know the recovery missions, something we were talking about last year, but in the Good Work Standard, MOPAC and us, we spent a lot of time making sure that included lots for exactly these groups. So we're doing our best, I think, within the levers that Mayor have, and I'm really grateful for the relationship that I've had with GLA colleagues who've been really receptive to everything we've been asking.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to say thank you for your offer to look into what information disseminate, how, when. We really appreciate openness.
No, definitely. Apologies if I misunderstood you as well.
That's fine. Argy-bargy in here. The Chair will greatly receive any information in that way.
Thank you. We're going to have a quick question from Assembly Member Ahmed and then on to Assembly Member Sheikh.
Thank you very much. Well, this is a question for you. And as the Assembly Member for Lambeth, where Brixton Nick is, I'm sure they don't mind. I really don't. You talked about the schemes that are set up by the Ministry of Justice in terms of learning and assisting with rehabilitation. My concern is that there is a gap. I mean, I think from MOPAC, and we're doing as much as we can from the Mayor's office. Could you identify what more the MOJ can provide to actually help things make the processes easier?
Well, I think I'll always, I don't know, my experience of London as a system, and you know, I do a lot of convening of the criminal justice system in London, is that we think we'll be successful, I think everyone around the table, if we work on a London basis. And I think the challenge is often that the way those services are set up, prisons or probation or DWP, is they're set up on a sort of central model. Ironically, that centre is in London. But what this means is they have limited discretion sometimes to join up. And when I talked about those really complicated needs of ex-offenders right at the beginning, you know, all those different things is really hard for really well-intentioned colleagues round my table and the Mayor's table at the London Criminal Justice Board. They don't always have the full kind of levers at their disposal to kind of really link the system up locally. And I think somewhere like London, that's where you get real benefit and real power. So, you know, to make a change. Sorry, not power for any other reason, but to make a change. So it'd be way more easier to work for businesses. It'd be way more easier to do other things. It'd be way more easier to join up the support if we have more of that sort of local discretion. So where we've got, you know, for example, that women's service or which I'm really proud of, or the Youth to Adult Transitions Hub, it's because the MOJ have allowed us to do something locally and allowed us to put the resources together. You know, the thing is, those are the things that work. So I really want to see more of those, frankly. I think that's the answer, is more integration, more local join up, you know, more of us able to use the resources that are in our communities rather than separate things. I think that would make the biggest difference to getting people to the point where then they can accept the job offers that you know, loads of people are trying to provide. Because 1 in 5 isn't good enough, is it? Yeah, sorry.
No, thank you, Chair.
Shall I crack on? Yeah, thanks. Just building on that. So, Darren, I just wanted to come to you and ask, from your experience working with ex-offenders, are there any regional differences in the support initiatives available to help them access employment? How does London compare to other regions in the UK?
That's a really difficult question. We do work nationally with lots of prisons up and down the UK and with ex-offenders everywhere. London, often travel can be cost prohibitive, which is always an issue. So particularly when we work with colleagues on Rottle, who are still in custody. As Duncan quite rightly mentioned before, lots of the prisons in central London don't offer Rottle because of the security category, so that pushes us out to the open prisons further away from the capital, and often because they're in the middle of nowhere, public transport is not the best in terms of provision, and it can be very expensive as well. And when serving prisoners are faced with a 40% deduction through the Prisoners Earning Act, which is paid to victims' charities, that's a big chunk of their earnings taken away from them. Individual governors do have discretion to lower that down to nothing to cover things like travel expenses, but it can still be an issue, and it is completely down to the discretion of that individual governor. It's a difficult question, to be honest with you. There's good practice everywhere, pockets of good practice everywhere. The only obvious things which springs to mind in London is, yes, we've got more opportunities in terms of vacancies for our business, but travel can be very expensive and cost prohibitive.
Absolutely. I guess part of the question as well was about initiatives available. So I don't know, beyond the kind of infrastructural hurdles.
There seems to be more in London, so obviously Standout, we mentioned before. Standout are predominantly based in London, is that correct? Yeah, so there are lots of good organisations like Standout up and down the country, but there seems to be a lot better provision in the capital.
Okay, thank you. And just to yourself, but to anyone else who wants to come in on this, what action would you like to see from prisons, the government and the Mayor to support employers such as Timpson's to provide more employment opportunities for ex-offenders? I
think the obvious one, not so beneficial for us, but other employees who are looking to get into recruiting in this space, would be national insurance reductions for employers who are going to give opportunities to ex-offenders or people with convictions, and end to the short sentences, which have been covered well by Natasha today, particularly for women, because they're incredibly damaging when women are often the linchpin of the family unit, and these very short sentences result in children getting taken off them, accommodation being lost. whereas male counterparts often don't receive a custodial sentence for the same offence and are able to pretty much crack on with their lives. And end to Friday releases, which would be a huge benefit. Obviously, when people are released on Friday, if they need to engage with services such as alcohol services, probation services, these agencies simply aren't open over the weekend. So that sort of 2-day danger period is a real risk. And obviously, we've mentioned the Prisoners Earning Act as well. While people are still in custody, they're subject to a 40% levy. So any serving prisoner that earns over £20 a week has got to pay that 40% deduction. That should be lowered down to zero, or certainly 10-15%, something more manageable and acceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. Thank you.
Sorry, Assemblyman, can you just repeat that? I missed that about the levy.
Yeah, so the rule is that every serving prisoner in England and Wales who earns over £20 a week, so prisoners on Rottle, for example, who are working out in the community, they're subject to a 40% deduction, which is a victims levy. So that chunk of money gets paid to victims charities. Our view is that it's just simply too much. And when you consider lots of people in custody have lost everything in terms of accommodation, they might need to buy a vehicle, find somewhere to live, get a new job. They need every penny they can get to give themselves a fighting chance of getting back on an even keel when they get released. Individual governors do have autonomy to reduce that down to nothing, but often some governors will just stick to the default position of 40%, and it's not fair, and it puts some employees in the strange position of feeling that they're being exploitative by asking people to come out, do a hard day's work for effectively 40% less money than their counterparts.
Yeah, totally agree. Did anyone else want to add anything to that question in terms of prisons, government and mayor, and what support they can give employers like Timpson's to provide more employment opportunity for ex-offenders?
I will briefly, which is slightly to repeat what was said earlier, but I think that, to bring two of your questions together, one of the things that's unique about London is the ecosystem of the third sector operating here. Obviously got Working Chance on the panel with you, but you've got, as I mentioned earlier, Bounce Back doing training in HMP Brixton and other places. You've got Standout doing some fantastic things. There's an organisation called Beam who do work with homeless people and support them into employment. So I think just having a think about how to bring together a coalition of those charities to do something. And the reason I think that's so valuable is I entirely understand the point Will was making earlier about not duplicating commissioning around ETE services. I think what those charities do that is so valuable is they provide a holistic support for an individual. So they may be getting them into work, but actually they're finding them, they're making sure they've got somewhere to live, they're making sure they've got their universal credit sorted as well. They're probably giving them advice and mentoring and emotional support as well. So it's the kind of mentoring would be a really good shorthand for what lots of them are doing, and I'd say that is a big opportunity. I think we've made a lot of investments recently in systems and people and processes in prisons, and I think the next stage is to make sure people have got someone kind of walking alongside them after release, and often when that's a non-statutory service that doesn't have power over them and is working with them, that's very beneficial for them.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that.
Can I nip in there?
Yeah, please.
So in terms of what we'd want from prisons, I think that what New Futures Network are doing is fantastic, and it's great MOJ have invested in them, and it's great that there are the prison employment leads and the prison employment advisory boards in place. I think it will be really interesting to see how that pans out and to hear how that is actually received by people in prison, women in our case. And I hope that the provision is sufficiently trauma-informed for women, because everything that happens to women in women's prisons needs to be trauma-informed, and it's sufficiently sensitive and tailored to each individual woman to really kind of develop her aspiration, her confidence and her self-belief and think about where she wants to go. And I'm not being cynical. I have every reason to hope that it will be like that, but you know, the proof will be in the pudding when we actually evaluate that with women on the ground. And I just think the other thing is just about, not so much about supporting employers to have vacancies, but it's the employers who aren't here, it's the employers who aren't Timpsons and Halfords and Greggs and everyone else that we need to be targeting. I would point the committee towards the market research that we did, and I'll send you a link. It's called Progress and Prejudice. It's a huge piece of research with all employers. I mean, you can extrapolate to say this is what employers believe. And as I said, while things are getting better, there's still a remaining kind of pocket of very, very serious prejudice and lack of understanding of risk, as we've heard from colleagues. So I think that, the London Mayor and all elected politicians have a role and a platform there in influencing public and employer attitudes to remember that people with convictions are a forgotten and underrepresented group who've experienced disadvantage along pretty much every step of their life, and they need to be seen within the broader diversity and inclusion work.
Thank you, Natasha. That was really helpful. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And do come back to us with those links, and also, Duncan, those other groups, the coalition idea that you had. That would be great. Thank you. Assembly Ahmed has promised that it's going to be a very, very quick question, and then we'll go to Assembly Member Garrett.
Thank you, Chairman. It will be very quick. Natasha, I absolutely agreed with what you said. And my question actually is to you, Darren, on the back of Assembly Member Sheikh's question. The work that you are doing at Timpson's, the way that you are taking forward, the initiatives and the other businesses that we've heard about today, it's really encouraging. What I'd like to know, because I think businesses listen to other businesses, it doesn't matter how many reports we have or, how many organisations speak to them, it's other businesses who are in the same sort of situation who they're more likely to listen to. Is there a network? I mean, how do you speak to other businesses about this and explain? And the story you gave is lovely about how the Timpsons got involved. How is that message being spread across the business community?
It's a really good question, and I think I completely agree in that Duncan and obviously the team of the MOJ and NFN have done some excellent work in terms of employer engagement, but there's still, I wouldn't say suspicion, but obviously Duncan's got skin in the game, so when Duncan and Duncan's team are trying to convince employees to recruit from this cohort, often it can be like, well, you would say that's your job to do that. So that's why the business-to-business approach is still extremely valuable, because we will give them an honest kind of warts and all analysis of the whole ex-offender piece. And there's an organisation called EFRA, which I sit on a leadership panel for. So EFRA is the Employees Forum for Reducing Reoffending. And this is made up of a number of quite sizable businesses and organisations which meet quarterly. And we offer free business-to-business advice to other employers who are keen to recruit from this cohort. And again, we offer sort of real-life examples. We share stories of what are the good prisons to work with, where's the good practice, what agencies should you access, and that is really, really valuable.
But that's almost pushing an open door, because they're already in, they're interested, they're part of that network. What about the other organisations, the other businesses outside of that? How are you getting that message across? Is there a way of doing that?
We don't force the message down anybody's throat. So typically with our network, as Duncan said before, the people in our network generally tend to be other retailers, but because of our work that we've done with the Employment Advisory Boards, there's lots of other businesses now from lots of different sectors. And whilst they've got the will to do it, because they either want to tick that all-important CSR box, or they just need to fill vacancies, or they genuinely believe it's the right thing to do due to kind of altruistic beliefs, they will still come to us anyway and ask us for advice around in risk and process and policy, etc. So we're always there to sort of help other businesses along. But for sort of 12 years now, since the inception of the NFN, it was kind of just us and a handful of other businesses, as well as the third sector organisations doing this. But now with the NFN on board, they've got a sort of huge resource to get the message out and to act as that sort of broker in terms of relationships for organisations and prisoners and sort of hand-holding. And it's been a huge sort of positive step in my opinion.
Okay, it's great to hear. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Can I just jump in there as well, just to say there is a piece of work going on at the moment with a lot of the larger businesses coming together to create a fair chance kind of charter type thing. I can't remember all the details, and my colleague's dealing with it, but when we know a bit more about that, we'll be happy to share that.
Yeah, that would be great if we could get that, Chair. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, you're all very welcome to write to us later on. That'll be fantastic. Thank you. Assembly Member Garrett.
Hello. Just to Will, really. So I know the Mayor had a plan, a £3 million sort of reducing reoffending pilot programme, which I think started in 2021, and I think it's due to wind up in a few weeks' time. So I assume there isn't a final report yet because it hasn't quite finished. But is there a sense of what that's achieved and what that's doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're referring to the. I mean, MOPAC does a lot of commissioning, and I'm absolutely not allowed to have favourites. But if I did have a favourite, it would be this one. So this is the U2 Adult Transitions Hub, which is a big. There's some mayoral money in there. It's £3 million. It's a massive joint enterprise between loads of different partners, the local authority, probation, etc., etc. It's absolutely brilliant, exactly how it should be. So it's a holistic trauma-informed service for 18 to 25-year-olds on probation. We know also that 17-year-olds on certain offence types will transition as well into it. We've extended it for another year because MOJ colleagues, it was initially funded by the Treasury as part of their kind of innovation fund, which we're really grateful for, and then we obviously found a little bit of money at City Hall to help. We do have an interim evaluation, which is extremely positive. What's actually incredibly positive is the impact it's made on staff, actually. These trauma-informed approaches and the way we deal and manage with risk in the community. You know, I was down there a few weeks ago chatting with the probation staff, and, you know, you can just tell when someone's been really affected by, you know, a bit of additional training they'd had. This was a probation officer of, 15, 20 years, and he was just saying the way I manage risk has just completely changed as a result of this. But I think what makes the real difference is the fact it is holistic. I know we keep saying holistic, but we've got real specialist provision exactly for that group. And we do have, sorry, I'm just trying to find I do have some headline ETE figures, which I'm just trying to find in my briefing because I want to get them right. I think it's 65% of young adults coming in who marked that they required with help with education, training, employment. Of those, I think 95% have now said that they feel that their skills and confidence has improved in that area. So I think what this is telling us is, this isn't going to shock you, but proper tailored trauma-informed support for particular vulnerable groups of people provides them with to overcome some of the barriers that we started talking about today. I mean,
so do you have,
news anyway.
You're talking about, so it's in Newham, isn't it? Yeah. So I suppose my two follow-up questions are: one is about geographic spread, and secondly is about the outcomes. Because I think not to sound too much like a horrible person, but it's lovely that we spend lots of money and people feel good about it. But where are we seeing real benefits? Cause,
Totally. So I mean, I remember when we had the Police and Crime Committee, we had a bit of a chat about reoffending outcomes before, and the challenge is obviously we need some time to pass before we can give that full kind of evaluation of whether this really has or hasn't prevented someone from offending. So that will take a little bit of time. So we're using a series of proxy outcome measures, and the Treasury actually sort of validated our approach to that. Geographic spread, it's only in one borough.
Sorry, before I realised I did that thing of asking you two different questions.
Oh, okay, sure.
So in terms of what are the proxy outcomes? What are they? I mean, what is it that you're measuring as a proxy outcome, and what do those outcomes look like?
So a variety of things. I mean, normally with this type of work, you would measure a sort of distance travelled and sort of attitudes and behaviours. So we commissioned actually as the Reducing Reoffending Board a big needs analysis into barriers to reoffending, and actually, although I mentioned all of those things earlier, it is actually attitude and behaviours which is the number one causality. So to measure those sorts of things, you tend to use a distance travelled tool of some sort, and that is a recognised and evidence-based way of doing it. What was I thinking and feeling about some things at one point in time? Some kind of intervention takes place. What am I thinking and feeling now? And that does have quite a strong evidence base in then. But it is social science, so we can never be. It's not. Sorry, I did chemistry at university. It's not A to B. But I think that's quite robust.
Well, okay. I mean, I'll fly the flag for social science. I think it is real science.
Apologies, I didn't mean to denigrate.
No, that's okay. But obviously, specifically, our focus today is about into work. So I don't know whether and I suppose it seems to me that's something that happens probably fairly quickly if it's going to happen, because we talked earlier about how people get back into bad old ways. So if they are getting into a good new way, presumably you would see that quickly. I don't know whether that's one of the things you're measuring or whether.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm putting you on the spot and asking you a bunch of numbers.
No.
So
absolutely.
And I see you're digging through your report.
Yeah, so. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I do. I'll get back to you on that, because there is like a really robust whole framework around this. I mean, it is relatively small numbers of people because it is a pilot. Mm-hmm. To speak to your second point, it is only in one borough. And this is MOPAC kind of, we don't have any statutory reason for being in this space. We convene the criminal justice system. We really, we have outcomes about this in the police and crime plan. So what we seek to do is find the places where we think we can support innovation, where we think we can build a bigger case, we can pilot, we can test, we can bring some of that mayoral convening power to help, try something that clearly works. Ministry of Justice would like to try this model somewhere else in the country first. I think that's probably sensible to try and see if it's replicable with not London. Obviously, in the meantime, we're pushing really hard because we think it's probably good enough already to prove that it works, and we'd like to have it in every London borough. The slight challenge is, probation are really struggling to recruit at the moment. They have a lot of vacancies, and that does give them workforce pressures that mean at the moment it is going to be challenging just for the probation side, not even the wraparound support. But we remain hopeful, Neil. Sorry, Assembly Member Garrett, that was too informal. Apologies.
That's okay. I don't object. So I think probably the bigger answer to my question really is to look at that. Is that a published report? Is that your interim review you mentioned? Is that something that's already published, or is it something you're working on that we'll see in due course?
I don't know. All MOPAC evaluations do make their way onto the MOPAC website, be they interim or not. There is a clearance process which is not entirely within my gift, so I don't know whether this one has made it through yet. But can I get back to you on that?
Sure. Yep. And then I had two sort of wrapping up type questions that I was just reading here, and I think we may have covered them. One was about the work that MOPAC and the Mayor have carried out with employers and Job Centre Plus to identify employment opportunities for ex-offenders, and what impact has that been? I'm not sure whether there's anything to add on that we haven't already been around on. If there's anything you wanted to add that's not repetitive.
I don't think so. There's a lot going on. I mean, something I suppose that did come up, I suppose, that we didn't talk about, which was in the blueprint for women specifically, where we've got an action on this. Actually, we're meeting with the GLA Education Skills team are meeting with some of Duncan's colleagues actually this week on exactly the topic that was raised by the Assembly earlier about could ex-offenders, particularly women in this case, fill some of those vacancies that London is experiencing. So I just wanted to report, we are also picking up the same issues, and we're trying to push hard too.
Yeah, and then my final question, the question I had here was about further action that can be taken across London's criminal justice system to provide support for ex-offenders to access employment. Again, I think it's put in there just in case, is there anything that has come out in the course of this conversation, or that hasn't come out, that has popped into your brains while we've been talking? So that is the sort of final question. So if there's anything else that we haven't already covered, but I feel like we've probably covered most things, but I'm feeling lots of thoughtful pursed lip nods, so I'll take that as a nothing further. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm really, really glad that we did this. We've learnt a lot today, and the London Assembly is the voice of London, and there are voices that we're not hearing from, and today we've heard about a particular group that really has been ignored, so grateful for everyone's contributions today. We have reached the end of the session. I would like to thank you all for coming. I understand, Darren, you came all the way from Liverpool. Amazing. So thank you very much for that. The committee does have a few more items of business to deal with. You're very free to leave, but I'll be very, very quick. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Yep, noted.
Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group leads to agree any output arising from the discussion?
Agreed.
Can I ask the committee to note the work programme for 2022-23 Assembly year?
Agreed.
Thank you. The next meeting of the Economy Committee is scheduled on 15th of March 2023 at 10 a.m. in the Chamber in City Hall. I have no other urgent business. That concludes today's meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chair.